Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be walking you through the prompt for Essay 1. That's due tomorrow morning. So that's Wednesday, September 23rd by 10 a.m. And so I'm just going to point some things out and also give you some suggestions for how to kind of break down what the prompt is asking you to do. Okay, so I'll share my screen and we'll pull up the prompt. So this is our homepage, and we can find the prompt under our week 4 module through our checklist. Okay, so here you click on Essay 1 Rough Draft. It has a link to the prompt. So the rough draft needs to be 3 full pages, and the final draft needs to be 4 full pages. And so really for the rough draft, if you aim for 2 body paragraphs, at least 2 fully developed body paragraphs, and include an intro and a conclusion, then I would say minimum 4 paragraphs you want to shoot for. And what we'll do for the final draft, we'll go back in and we'll more fully develop those body paragraphs, and also maybe add a body paragraph, and that's how we'll get from 3 full pages to 4 full pages. Okay, so on each of the prompts, I'll list the readings that we're combining and making connections between, and I'll also include the works cited information. Okay, so at the end of your essay, you want to include a works cited page, in MLA format, and basically these sources are already cited in MLA format for you, so you can just cut and paste them onto the document, and just get in the habit for when you move into your other classes, to always have a works cited page, and to document all the information. Reader would need to find that source. Okay, so the prompt. And so one thing I want to point out for the prompt is instructors, and this will be the same in XPOS as for basic comp, but we always do this kind of preamble at the beginning before we set up the full-fledged prompt question, right, which will be in bold. And part of the reason we do that is not only to kind of build up to the prompt question, but also to demonstrate how to introduce texts and how to cite quotations. Okay, so for example, in Small Change, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted, published in 2010, Malcolm Gladwell took issue with those who envisioned social media as having reinvented social activism. Okay, so this is an example of how to introduce a text for the first time. So in the introduction to your own essays, you'll need to introduce the full article. So in other words, don't just include Small Change, but add the colon, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted. So full title, along with the full name of the author. So both first name and last name. So Malcolm Gladwell. And then after that, whenever we refer to Gladwell, we can just use his last name. So you don't need to repeatedly use first and last name, just that first time. Okay, and notice when I later introduce who, I do the same thing. So the full title, so the second act of social media activism, colon, has the internet become better at mediating change? When I introduce her, it's first and last name. So I introduce her for the first time, full name, and then after that, you can just use her last name, who, right? And that shows up here. Okay, so if you read through the full thing, right? So Malcolm Gladwell took issue with those who envisioned social media as having quote unquote reinvented social activism. Okay, so notice I've included a quotation, right? And that means that at the end of the sentence, I need to use parentheses and place the page number that I found that quotation on in those parentheses, right? So that's called a parenthetical citation or an in-text citation. Okay, so again, one thing you want to do before you submit your rough draft is to go back through all of your quotations to make sure that they have those parentheses with a page number at the end of each one. Okay, also, we'll notice as I read through the preamble here that you can do a lot of different things with quotations. Okay, so for really important, substantial quotations, for example, that you'll find in your body paragraphs, the quotations that you're going to use to make a connection between the text. So those you'll generally use a full sentence or two, right? A 1 to 2 sentence quotation. But in other places, right, you can use a short phrase or a little chunk of quotation, a chunk of a sentence, and that can be used to integrate detail and to make your discussion of the text more specific. So for example here, right, so quote unquote, reinvented social activism, not a full sentence, right? So you can just use a little chunk of text there. Okay, so these quote unquote digital evangelists, so bringing in a key term for Gladwell. So as Gladwell referred to them, quote, seem to have forgotten what activism is. Notice my parenthetical citation. So that came on page 3 of Gladwell's article. As a reminder, he returned us to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, demonstrating how this high-risk activism, and so notice when I'm offering an overview to my reader, who I am assuming has not read these texts, and so as a writer, I will need to fill the reader in on what these articles are about, what Gladwell's argument is, what Hughes' argument is, and then what you're doing with those 2 texts for this assignment. So again, I assume the reader doesn't know, and to give them a really accurate and detailed and specific overview of the text, I want to bring in some key terms when necessary, especially in the body paragraphs. You're going to work with those. And so I'm bringing in, right, Gladwell's key term of high-risk activism, okay, and enabled through strong ties in a hierarchical organization, was able to quote unquote challenge the status quo to attack deeply rooted problems. Okay, so again, you don't want to just cram them all together like that in your own body paragraphs. But the point here is to integrate those key terms and to define them for your reader in your body paragraphs. Right. So as a general rule of thumb in your introduction, you don't want to necessarily engage with key terms unless they're really, really important. Like for our situation here, the second act of social media activism, very important, right? So you have to kind of lay down a definition of what that means, what second act social media activism is, in order to set up this connection making that you're doing between what Hugh is adding to the conversation and what Gladwell already added to the conversation. Okay, and so also, you know, these key terms I'm listing, these are some key terms that you may want to bring into your body paragraphs to make your response more specific. So keep those key terms in mind. So high-risk activism, strong ties, hierarchy, and his definition, right, of true or real or actual social activism and social change is activism that challenges the status quo, that attacks deeply rooted problems. So that may be a quotation that you want to integrate at some point. Especially since the prompt is asking you, right, to think of how Who's argument complicates his claim that social media is not at all like the activism of the civil rights movement. So to do that, right, at some point in your essay, you're going to have to define how Gladwell views the social activism of the civil rights movement, right? And so this would be a very fitting quotation to say, okay, well, the civil rights movement, that kind of activism challenged the status quo, right? Attacked deeply rooted problems. And then think about how perhaps some of social media activism's second act, according to Hugh, maybe does the same thing, right? So is there any evidence of second act social media activism challenging the status quo and attacking deeply rooted problems? Okay, so according to Gladwell, the kind of activism associated with social media, on the other hand, isn't like this at all. So Gladwell is very clear-cut in the distinction he makes between civil rights activism and social media activism, right? So writing 10 years later, in the second act of social media activism, has the internet become better at mediating change? Jane Hu traces the evolution, right, the changes of social media's role in social activism from the digital activism that Gladwell addressed, and which Hu would refer to, right, as first act social media activism. um, to the recent protests of the past year or so. She pays particular attention to the second act of the Black Lives Matter movement, which took on a new life in response to the killing of George Floyd over the summer. So the second act, quote unquote, of BLM, who argues, has evinced a scale, creativity, and endurance that challenges those skeptical of the internet's ability to mediate a movement, among whom we might include Malcolm Gladwell. So in other words, right, based on Gladwell's argument, we can kind of categorize him as one of these people who are skeptical of the internet's ability to mediate a movement. So in other words, skeptical of social media activism. Okay, and so really what the prompt is asking you to do is to think about how Hu's argument, how her analysis of second act social media activism challenges Malcolm Gladwell's claim that social media activism is not at all 0% similar, not at all like the civil rights movement activism. Okay, so for this essay, I invite you to place Gladwell and Hu into conversation. So analyzing and synthesizing textual evidence from both texts compose an essay that answers the following question. So in what ways does Hu's analysis of social media activism's second act complicate Gladwell's claim that social media is not at all like the activism of the civil rights movement? Okay, and so, you know, to start generating a response here and to think about how to compose a thesis statement that responds directly to this prompt question, we have to kind of interpret this word complicate, right? And so one way to think about it is, you know, how does Hu's analysis challenge, right, Gladwell's claim that social media activism is not at all like the activism of the civil rights movement? So in other words, you know, does Hu provide us with ways that the second act of social media activism actually is similar to the civil rights movement? And so, you know, one way to think about putting these two texts into conversation is, you know, Gladwell makes a lot of distinctions that are clear cut, kind of either or, right? So kind of on one hand, we have the civil rights movement activism, which is not at all, which is completely opposite for him to social media activism. Okay, and we bring in Hu, and she kind of messes up that clear-cut distinction. She makes it more complex. She says, that's not as cut and dry. We're more into shades of gray here. Maybe I can point out some similarities of how second act social media activism has actually kind of integrated some of the characteristics of the civil rights movement. And you see this kind of clear-cut making oppositions in Gladwell's argument in his key terms as well. So his key terms exist in opposition, right? So it's strong ties versus weak ties, right? So strong ties are the opposite of weak ties. Hierarchies are the opposite of networks. And so we'll see this when we get to the thought provoker questions. You know, you're looking for ways where you can kind of say, using Hu, well, maybe networks and hierarchies aren't necessarily opposite, right? Maybe there's some middle ground between the two. Maybe a movement could have some qualities of a network and some qualities of a hierarchy, right? Maybe the two aren't mutually exclusive or complete opposites, in other words. Okay, and so, and this will be the pattern on all of our prompts this semester. So you'll have the kind of lead in to the prompt question itself in bold, and then you'll have these thought provoker questions, and they're designed to help you start generating responses to the prompt. They're brainstorming. And so I recommend just kind of cut and pasting these questions into an empty document and just start kind of drafting kind of messy responses to them, and bringing in kind of copy and pasting quotations from the text that you think would be important for addressing these thought provoker questions, right? So just do this kind of messy thinking, brainstorming, generating ideas in its own document. Let it be messy, right? And then from there, once you've responded to all three of those questions, then think about, okay, my responses here, the ideas and connections, I've started making between the text, how do they allow me to generate an overall answer to this question, right? And so, by the way, a thesis statement can be 1 to 3 sentences long. Okay, so you don't have to cram all of that information into one sentence. So in other words, if we're exploring multiple ways that who challenges or complicates uh, Gladwell's claims, then you don't have to shove them all in one sentence, right? You have 3 sentences to kind of lay those all out. Okay, so if we take a look at the thought-provoker questions, so the first one, Gladwell focuses on how digital activism differs from the traditional activism that characterized the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? And so for him, they're complete opposites, right? They're not at all similar. And so notice, digital activism, traditional activism. So here I'm giving you some key terms that you can play around with. So these are Gladwell's key terms, right? Traditional activism is how he describes the civil rights movement activism. And digital activism is how he refers to who refers to as social media activism. Okay, and then we shift over to who. However, what might digital activism in its second act, right? So if we think about second act digital activism, what might it actually have in common with the civil rights movement, right? Again, does it have any elements of hierarchy? Does it have any elements maybe of strong ties? Which leads us then to the second two questions. So Gladwell argues that if you're taking on a powerful and organized establishment, you have to be a hierarchy. Okay, and you want to think about, well, in light of reading Hugh, right, to what extent does this claim prove true in the case of the second act of social media activism, right? So do you have to be 100% a hierarchy in order to using Gladwell's definition, right? In order to challenge the status quo, in order to attack deeply rooted problems. So in other words, what we're doing is, if you imagine, so Gladwell, right? So he's kind of like, you have network and you have hierarchy and they're opposites. So what you want to think of who doing is going, okay, well, you have network and you have hierarchy, but maybe there's like a spectrum between them, right? Maybe you can be somewhere in the middle where you're like 50% network, 50% hierarchy, or 30% hierarchy and 70% network, right? So you want to think in those terms. So, thinking of those middle areas, percentages, that's complication, right? That's kind of what we mean when we're using that verb. Okay. And the third question, so how might Hugh's description of the kind of back-end work, again, giving you a key term that you might be able to use in your paragraphs to make your analysis and connections more specific. So back-end work that has taken place with recent protests, second act protests, complicate the clear-cut opposition that Gladwell establishes between hierarchies and networks, which you just talked about, and also strong ties and weak ties. So for Gladwell, you have strong ties on one end and you have weak, sorry, there's a bug joining us here for our video. So you have strong ties on one end and weak ties on the other. For Gladwell, they're opposites. There's no middle ground. Either they're strong ties or they're weak ties. Okay, but is there a way to think about how, well, maybe there's something in the middle, right? Where you have like medium strength ties, right? So they're not all the way weak and they're not all the way strong, right? Is that possible? And can we find maybe evidence of that in Hugh's text? Okay, so in terms of drafting strategies, so always start with a text, right? So again, you want to have those thought-provoker questions in a document, you're brainstorming, you're thinking. And even before you do that, what I recommend doing is rereading, right? We keep emphasizing how to more fully understand the text, reread, reread, reread. So for our essays and also for our synthesis quizzes, where the questions will be asking you to make connections between the text, you want to reread a text with the other text in mind. Okay, so for example, here we would go back and we would reread Gladwell, keeping who in mind, right? And so we would do another round of annotations. So, okay, I'm going to reread Gladwell. Every time I see a kind of connection to who, I'm going to write what the connection is in the margin. right? So in other words, you're kind of reading Gladwell as if you are who. What would who say to some of these claims that Gladwell is bringing in? How would she interpret some of the evidence or the examples that Gladwell is using? And then you do the reverse. So you read back through who with Gladwell in mind. Okay, so what passages and who can you hear Gladwell, right? Or some of his key terms that would apply to who, that who doesn't use, but would apply to who. And where would Gladwell kind of agree or disagree with who? And then what you have, right, when you have these passages marked, when you come here to start brainstorming the thought provoker questions and thinking about your overall answer to the question of the prompt, you're going to have passages that are already marked. Those are going to be your connection paragraphs, right? And when you go to build up and draft your body paragraphs, you're going to base each body paragraph on a connection, right? A connection that allows you to answer the overall question of the prompt, right? And so here we want to make sure we're distinguishing between thesis statement and thesis. Okay, so for the writing program, the thesis statement, right, that's the 1 to 3 sentence answer to the question of the prompt, placed in bold. That should be located at the end of your introduction. That's the thesis statement. 1 to 3 sentence answer to the question of the prompt, end of the introduction. Okay, the thesis, when we refer to just a thesis, that's your overall argument. That's the argument as it takes shape and develops and becomes more specific and nuanced over the course of your body paragraphs, right? So it's your argument as it's taking shape and being supported in your body paragraphs. Okay. And so again, what you're doing is you're finding those connections, you know, between the text, you're bringing those in as you're drafting responses to the thought provoker questions. And then from there, you know, I recommend not writing your introduction, to write the introduction last. So I recommend starting with your first body paragraph, right? Finding out what that connection is, right? So what particular way in which who complicates Gladwell's claim are you going to focus on in this paragraph? And then what's the next way? And how do those ways connect, right? Once you build up those body paragraphs, then what you do is you go back and write the introduction, and your thesis statement is going to integrate those ways that who complicates Gladwell's argument that you discussed in each body paragraph into the thesis statement, right? And so there's that kind of formula. So the kind of connection or claim that you're making in each body paragraph, you go back and you plug it into your thesis statement. Okay, and just making sure, and this is in bold on the prompt, for each body paragraph, since we're focusing on making connections between the texts. So in other words, you don't want a full paragraph on Gladwell and then a full paragraph on who. Because the danger with that is you keep them both separate and you're not actually forming connections or synthesizing the two texts, right? You're kind of saying, okay, well, this is what Gladwell says, and then this is what who says, and then just kind of handing it over to the reader, right? Kind of expecting the reader to do the work of connection making. Okay, so you never want to do that. So you want to make sure both who and Gladwell are in the same paragraph and that you're explicitly stating what the connection is that you're making and how that connection ties back to your answer to the question of the prompt and to your thesis statement. Okay, so both texts, Gladwell who in each body paragraph, and one quotation from each text in each body paragraph, okay? And so what you're gonna have then is a minimum of 2 quotations per body paragraph, one from who, one from Gladwell. Okay, notice that's a minimum. You can have more than that, but the bare minimum you can have 1 quotation from who, 1 from Gladwell in each body paragraph. Okay, just quick note on format then. So this will be Times New Roman, 12-point font, double-spaced, 1-inch margins. You want a title for your paper, and it can be just something, you know, it can be 2 words long in the rough draft stage, right? So just kind of brainstorm something. And, you know, suggestions for writing effective titles. I mean, look to who and Gladwell's titles, right? And think about the ways that those titles express their arguments and the projects that they've set out for themselves to complete in their essay. Okay, and then also, as I mentioned earlier, you want a works cited page at the end. So just write works cited at the top, and then you're going to cut and paste or copy and paste the bibliographic information from Gladwell and who. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. And before you head out, just a few questions, right? And this earns you credit for um, watching the video. So the first question, so where should your thesis statement be located in your essay? Okay, I'll pause and let you respond. Okay, so the thesis statement, right, should show up at the end of your introduction. Okay, so second question, how many sentences can a thesis statement be? Right, so a thesis statement can be 1 to 3 sentences long. And last question, so how many quotations minimum should you include in each body paragraph? Yeah, so we need a minimum of 2 quotations for each body paragraph. So 1 quotation from who connected to 1 quotation from Gladwell at minimum. You could have more than that, but you need at least 2 quotations per body paragraph. Okay, great. So I'm looking forward to reading your rough drafts. And again, how this works is I'll be, as instructors in Basic Comp, we offer feedback for the first essay and also the third. So I'll be giving you feedback, some marginal comments, some overall comments. And so you'll have those comments in addition to peer review comments, and you'll be getting instructions soon for how to conduct peer review. Okay, take care.